What's up, all you cats and kittens? If you guys are all part of that Tiger King craze, I actually found it highly entertaining. So, I'm not going to spoil anything for you, but man, that Carol Baskins, I'm telling you. All right. Anyways, let's get into presentation mode and let's get ready for the third and final installment of Chapter 7, Learning. Up to this point, just to get you caught up, although you probably just click the next video if that's the way you roll. We had first talked about what learning is, new experiences and new behaviors acquired from the environment, and then we talked about classical conditioning first, which was the unconscious or implicit type of learning where your brain automatically associates two things from the environment. The example that Pavlov showed us was the dog and the bell and salivation. And Watson, of course, gave us Little Albert, which I realized I didn't add the Little Albert video into the set of links and videos, so I will do that as soon as this is done. In the second installment, we talked about B.F. Skinner, who expanded on a man named Edward Thorndike's ideas of the law of effect by creating what we know of as the conscious version of learning, and that was operant conditioning, where you consciously, explicitly make some type of behavior, and based on the consequence of that behavior, if it's good, you tend to do it more often. If it's bad and punishing, you tend to do it less. And we talked about schedules of reinforcement and all of those good things. So, in the third installment, we are going to go into cognitive learning and I will show you how, even though Watson and Skinner did not believe that mental processes had their place in this type of learning in behaviorism, I will show you that that is not necessarily true. And for the last installment, or the last type of learning, observational learning, we will go over the Bobo doll experiment, for which there is a video, and talk about how we learn also by observing others and doing it. So remember way back when we talked about the biopsychosocial scale, or axes of learning in psychology? Yes, we did that in the prologue before chapter 1. Well, let's take a second to review and apply it specifically to the ideas of learning. We have our biological influences, we have our psychological influences, and of course we have social cultural. On the biological side of things for learning, we have genetic predispositions, which means that may help us to or towards our preferences for what we like to learn. Some people struggle a lot with math and numbers, and some people get math and numbers pretty easily. That tends to be a genetic predisposition. Unconditioned responses that we have for things, and of course, our ability to adapt. This may also affect motivation to learn things, what types of things we might be more interested in learning, and things like that on the biological side. Psychological, right, is more like our environment. It's more of our nurture. So learning based on our previous experiences, being able to learn based on the predictability of an association. If we know that things go together, we tend to put them together. And of course, the idea of understanding generalizations, things that are very close, and discrimination, things that are not the same. Which means that it may be affected by the presence of others. We are actually going to visit this term or this concept more in chapter 13, which is social psych. We tend to be motivated more by certain people if the task is easy enough. If the task is harder, we tend to perform more poorly. What you will see in chapter 13, I'm going to give you a little preview, is why we say that in sports, which I miss dearly, is the home town advantage. When you're playing at home, not only are you having an advantage because you're not sleeping in a hotel and it's the place where you practice most of the time, but it's the fact that the crowd is behind you. So the presence of other people that are cheering you on and booing the other team or trying to distract them also helps in your performance and things like that. But it also helps in learning. So those are the three axes of psychology: the bio, the psycho, and the social. When we look at the ideas of classical conditioning and operant conditioning, it feels like it might be limitless for us. But biology has another idea. So you can look to specific studies that were done, or you can just look to examples in nature. Although we can put things together pretty quickly, what tends to happen for classical conditioning is that the things we learn most easily that don't take as many repetitions are things that are detrimental to our survival. Our brain seems to work on the fact that survival is the number one priority, which is a good priority to have. So what we see is that there are biological constraints on our ability for classical conditioning. For one thing, if you read in the book, it talks about Garcia and Colling's taste aversion research. We talked a little bit in chapter 6 about the different tastes and things like that. And also, one of the things in that chapter, bringing back chapter 6 a little bit, is that sometimes we talked about tastes having survival instincts, whether it was sweet and salty for biological processes like glucose and sodium to help our body run better, or it was, and of course protein, umami. But the other two were sour and bitter, which help us to detect things that taste funny, bitter, spoiled, things that could be potentially harmful to us. So Garcia and Colling were doing research with mice in the 1970s, and I think some of the cages were near a machine that was giving off radiation. Some of the radiation must have contaminated the water bottles that the mice were drinking from, because what ended up happening is whenever it was time for the mice to take a drink, they tended to avoid the water bottles. They did not like the way that it tasted. And when Garcia and Colling tried to figure out what was going on, they realized that there might have been some radioactive material or radioactive waves that might have um, interacted with and affected the way that it tasted in a harmful way. So it showed that even if in some cases, anything that's going to be more harmful to them or life-saving, they tend to stay away from. So what this shows is that animals and humans seem biologically prepared to learn certain associations rather than others. The ones that are for their survival, like certain tastes that could be poisonous to them, is going to be associated faster and stronger than some other things, like pairing a bell with food. We also see that conditioning is stronger when we say that the conditioned stimulus is ecologically relevant. And when we say ecologically relevant, that basically is a fancy way of saying that it is for your survival. It's your ecosystem, right? So we will learn those stronger and faster. So we can see that it is more important to our survival. We will learn it better and faster, usually. So that tells us there are some limits on the power of classical conditioning. In operant conditioning, it's pretty much the same idea. Nature can limit our capacity for operant conditioning. Although we would love to be able to climb mountains, and a lot of people do, some people do not possess the right strength or may have different issues. So even with the ideas of shaping that we talked about in the last lecture, of closer and closer approximations to that. You can only do what your body biological constraints that predispose us to learn, again, like classical conditioning, the associations that are naturally adaptive and important for our survival. We will learn the lesson faster and seem to understand it better if it is important for the survival of us and our species. The other thing that we noticed, and people can be conditioned out of things. One of the things that we use that I didn't mention in the last lecture is using operant conditioning for things like training people to stop bad habits. One of the biggest ones, or one of the most popular ones, I guess, that I use as an example in class normally is biting your nails. So a lot of times when people do that, they bite their nails. Why? Well, you can't answer me, so I'll answer for you. They bite their nails because it's a nervous habit, and maybe it's something they've already done. Um, so whenever you get nervous, maybe you try to bite your nails and you try to bite them, you're going to get that really nasty, soury, bitter taste in your mouth. And that's not fun, right? Or you could put gloves on or things like that. So whenever you bite or try to bite, it is a sort of a negative feeling. So some type of positive punishment um, to get you to decrease your habit. This works in animals as well. Animals that do something like, let's say that there's a dog that barks and it's keeping people up. You can use operant conditioning in animals to reduce those type of behaviors. But one thing we see in animals is at the first sign of danger or at the first sign of stress, they revert back to their biologically predisposed patterns. So putting that in terms for humans and in terms that you guys can understand, let's say you bite your nails. You've always done it. It's something that is instinctive. It's innate. You've always seemed to do it. And then you go and get it conditioned out of you. You go to a therapist or some sort of session, and it's wearing gloves. Maybe it's all of the above. But eventually, you learn to change your behavior pattern and you stop biting your nails. It was a nervous habit, it was a bad habit, and now you have been conditioned out of it. Well, guess what happens at the first sign of stress or danger? Like, oh, I don't know, a pandemic. You're stuck at home. You can't do the things that you want to do, and your levels of stress are going through the roof. Guess what's probably the first thing that's going to happen? Right back to biting your nails. We call this instinctive drift, and what it shows is that our biology is stronger than our conditioning, right? So not only is this showing that operant conditioning has its limits, but it also kind of shows my point from the first lecture in class. Nature seems to be stronger than nurture. And again, that may not be the case for everybody to believe, and that's okay. But I just wanted to kind of point that out. So when we talk about Skinner, and to that effect, we talked about Watson saying that the importance of cognition is very minimal, if at all. Second, the reasoning, as I already gave you in the other lectures, for operant conditioning is that we don't need to know your mental processes. Even though it is a conscious process, what we see is if you increase your behavior, we know that you liked it. It was a reinforcement or reward. If you decrease your behavior, it means you didn't like it. So according to Skinner, he said there is no need for cognition. We already know everything we need to know just by seeing you. And it makes sense on that level, right? Um, so for Watson, his was even easier. He said it's unconscious. Your brain's automatically doing it. You're not even aware. The association is automatic and the response is automatic, whether it's a startle response for something loud, whether it's salivation for putting food in front of you or ringing a bell, you're not even aware that you're learning. So how would you have mental processes involved? Well, those were pretty compelling arguments at the time. And in fact, mental processes, as you know, were almost lost for 40 to 50 years. But with technology and more research, we have shown that cognition and mental processes guide us in ways that we may not even be aware. For one thing, what Skinner did in the 1960s, as you saw, was put his pigeons and other animals on a schedule of reinforcement. When in studies that were done more recently than the 1960s, if you put an animal on a fixed interval reinforcement schedule, remember fixed interval is every so often. So let's just say, for argument's sake, it was every 3 times that a rat pressed a lever that they would get a pellet. Now, a rat's not able to count to 3, but what we have seen from recordings is that once the animal learns the reinforcement schedule, even though it doesn't know how to count to 3, every 3 times that the animal pushes the lever, it looks to anticipate and looks down towards the pellet box or the food delivery service, whatever it is, right? Maybe it's Uber Eats. I'm just kidding. Really, that was even worse. That was even bad for my taste. So every 3rd time that the animal presses the lever, it learns to anticipate that the food is coming. And even though an animal can't count to 3, somehow it seems to be able to respond and anticipate at that level. So there has to be some sort of mental process that's guiding the animal to know that. In rats, when we put a rat in a maze, right, the rat runs the maze and seems to be able to learn. How do we know that the rat learns? Because every time the rat runs the maze, if your times get faster and faster and the path that you take gets shorter and shorter, which means it's not running into dead ends, this is because one thing we've discovered in rats is that I talked about how the hippocampus in chapter 2, how the hippocampus has our internal GPS. Well, we found this out in rats, and that they develop a cognitive map of their environment, which means even in a simple maze or a not so simple maze, they are using that internal cognitive map that's part of the hippocampus to help guide them through it. We call this latent learning. And although they are motivated by putting cheese or something at the end for a reward, it's guided by the mental process of being able to map out their environment. The other thing that we've seen is the destruction of intrinsic motivation by excessive rewards. So intrinsic motivation, this is normally where I'd ask you guys if you know what that means. Intrinsic motivation is basically internal motivation, doing something because it makes you feel good, like feeding the homeless, or that all the motivation you need is getting really good grades in this class or at school because it makes you feel really good, and it basically delivers a reward to you that your hard work paid off. So what were to happen if your parents said, instead of just feeling really good about yourself for getting an A on this next exam, what if I gave you a car or a video game system or something really expensive? These excessive rewards destroy your intrinsic motivation. And what we found in studies is that people can judge how big the reward is. And these excessive rewards, if you're promised a car or something like that, they don't seem to care anymore about any internal motivation for wanting to pass the class. It is now all about that excessive reward. So the fact that they value some things more than others means that they're using cognitive processes and cognition in order to motivate themselves or do the things that they need to do and carry out these operant conditioning processes. We find the same thing in classical conditioning as well. Maybe not as much, but a little bit. When people associate an ice cream flavor, there was a study done associating an ice cream flavor with characters who are either good or bad. Most people did not realize that they did this, but when they saw the person, they rated them as good or bad. Here's the thing. When later they were told about the association between the ice cream flavor and the person who was either good or bad in this show or movie, it made their feelings even stronger about it. So the ones that they liked even more. The ones that they didn't like, they disliked even more. So what that shows is that even though it's automatic, there are some internal mental processes that are guiding both operant conditioning and, of course, classical conditioning. So let's get into the last type of learning. Now, obviously, we learn through punishment and rewards. That's how our parents taught us. We now know, and the simplest, most common form of learning is our brain making associations in the environment, which is, classical conditioning. But the fourth type, I guess 3.5, because mental processes, cognitive learning. The last type of learning, we'll call it, is learning by observing what others do. This is a huge part of our learning system. It's a huge part of what makes us human. We look and see what others are doing, and we copy it. When you're a kid, you're looking at your parents, your teachers, your brothers and sisters, your cousins, and other people around you, and a lot of times you try to copy what they do. So in observational learning, we see that both humans and higher animals like monkeys, apes, learn without direct experience by watching and imitating what others do. I find my son imitating the things that I do, and it's endearing to me because I know that he's trying to copy what I'm doing on his own, or he'll watch a YouTube video, right? I know that if the toilet breaks, and my wife says, "Why don't we call the plumber?" I tell her, okay, but why don't I watch this YouTube video first to see how to fix it, and then I'll go fix it. And so I do that, and when it still doesn't work, then we go call the plumber. But the point is a lot of us look to these YouTube videos to learn a new dance move or what the latest trend is or how to do certain things, and we learn by observing and copying others. This is a huge part of our learning. There was a professor from Stanford whose name is, because he's still alive, Albert Bandura. He's pretty old now, but he's still alive. And he did a lot of pioneering research in this idea. He came up with the idea of observational learning and how we model. One of the things I talked about with punishment and physical punishment is that may serve as modeling. And when people say, "Why do you hit your kids?" they say, "Well, my parents hit me and their parents hit them," and so on and so on and so on. And it was modeling as a way to take out your anger or to show that you disapprove of people's behaviors or things like that. And Bandura came up with this very compelling experiment called the Bobo doll experiment, which basically showed what he called vicarious reinforcement and vicarious punishment. So in this case, children learned from adults, not so much by asking them about things, but simply by observing their behavior, things that they did, both good and bad. Now, in the video that accompanies this lesson on the Bobo doll experience, the Crash Course Psychology video, you will see that most of the footage of this only shows the bad stuff. When the adult was acting badly, the child acted out in the same way. But what it didn't show you in the video, which was definitely a big part of the experiment, is that when the adults were really nice to the doll, the children were actually really nice as well. So both good and bad behaviors that were observed were shown in the children as they were observed in the adults. So what is this famous Bobo doll experiment? The famous Bobo doll experiment showed children who walked by a room and they saw these adults playing with this Bobo the clown doll. Basically, it's what we call a bop clown. So there's some sand or water or something weighty in the bottom, and the rest of it is filled with air so that you can hit the doll and it'll go down, but because of the shifting of the weight and heavy on the bottom, the doll will pop right back up again. So it's almost like a kid's version of a punching bag, but it's not suspended in air. They can hit it and knock it to the ground and it'll come back up for more. So Bandura wondered what would happen if children walked by and saw adults in this room, not their own parents, just adults, um, interacting with Bobo in different ways. Would they, upon observation, if they had the chance to get into a room with Bobo, would they do their own thing or would they copy what the adults did? And here we see on the top is the female figure. There were also males that did it too. But we see the female sitting on top of Bobo on the left. In the picture next to her on top, we see her throwing Bobo up in the air. There were some weapons in the room, like a tiny hammer. So we saw her picking up the hammer in the third one and knocking the clown over, as well as kicking the Bobo doll. When children, both girls and boys, had seen the adults play, quote unquote, with Bobo, you see the same exact behaviors that are modeled by the adults that the children are using. So they learned how to play with Bobo by watching the adults do it. So on the bottom left, you see a little girl sitting on top of Bobo and hitting Bobo in the head. You see a little boy in the next picture throwing Bobo up in the air, just like the woman above. You see the little boy grab a hammer and start hitting him. There was also a toy gun. And even though the adults didn't model the toy gun, they modeled the hammer. So the kid picked up the gun as well and started pretending to shoot it. Bang, bang, bang. And of course, in the last one, we see the little girl kicking Bobo over, just like the adult woman in the picture above her. So what this showed to Bandura was that we learn a great deal of our behaviors by watching what other people do in both good and bad ways. So again, what's not pictured is when the adults were being really nice to Bobo, so were the kids at that point. And so why does this happen? Why is observation such a big part of our learning? Well, it may be the fact that inside our frontal lobes, there are these clusters of neurons that work together that seem to be active while we are watching other people or mirroring what they do. In an fMRI study, people were asked to copy what they saw on a video or what they saw a person doing in real life. And when they did that, the researchers wanted to record which areas of brain would be active. And they were able to also record individual cells. And so in that area that lit up in the fMRI, they recorded individual cells. And these neurons that basically made noise, had action potentials, were going off while they were copying another person. They named them mirror neurons. And so these are the neurons that some scientists believe fire, and they've shown this, when performing certain actions or when observing another person doing so. Why do you think that we have special cells, those mirror neurons, that do that? Well, it allows us to learn by seeing others and being able to imitate them. They are also firing when people are empathic or showing empathy. What is empathy? Empathy is the ability to understand other people's problems. If you've ever watched a movie and you saw somebody get kicked in the midsection, and you cringed and went, oh, because maybe you can sort of it's almost like you felt it. That would be empathy. If you see somebody sad in a movie or on TV, in a play, even though it's fake and you're fairly certain it's fake, and yet you still cry because that is sad and you can kind of feel what they're going through, that's empathy. And what we see is that our brain can mirror that stuff. So it's not just the ability to copy what other people are doing, but it also works emotionally where we can feel what they are feeling. In fact, in a study done on pain, we have on the left somebody that actually got hurt and they're feeling pain. And on the right, we have somebody that is empathic. Sometimes you may have heard of sympathy pains for people who are married to men that are married to women that are pregnant. And when women are feeling pain, sometimes the men do too. Well, in a study on pain and empathy, we can see that in the brain, related activity to actual pain involves areas near the frontal lobe and above the temporal lobe, kind of right there. But also, of course, where is pain? Pain, if we remember back to chapter 6, pain is part of that touch pathway. And where the touch system is interpreted in the brain is right up top in the parietal lobe in that somatosensory cortex. So that's the actual pain, right? So on the left, the brain is related to actual pain. And on the right is the person seeing that person in pain. So in the brain of an observing loved one who sees their partner or family member, somebody close to them in pain, they have those emotional areas of the brain light up, but not the physical pain, which would be in the parietal lobe, in the somatosensory cortex. So as the slide says, empathy in the brain shows up in the emotional brain areas, but not in the somatosensory cortex, because remember, that's the physical pain. So looking at observational learning, the way we looked at classical conditioning, the way we looked at operant conditioning, shows that there are both good and bad effects. Some of the pro-social or good effects means that modeling can enhance learning of things like communication, sales, customer service. I don't know if any of you have ever worked in retail, but I worked at a couple of different music stores when there were such things in the 90s. And in the late 90s, in order to get a job to have my own car, my parents said that if you get a job, doesn't matter, how much or little it pays, as long as you can make your car payment, you can have a car. So I got a used car and I worked at Office Depot because a friend of mine was able to get me a job there. When I first learned how to work at the music store and how to work at Office Depot, how I was trained was by watching somebody that had been doing it for a long time. I watched them ring up the cash register. I watched them handle customers and talk to them, and I learned the ins and outs by observing them. So behavior enhances learning in new employees. When you model nonviolent behaviors, it also prompts similar behaviors in others. I think about times when I see people donating for a certain cause or things like that. A lot of times it may not be the gesture of donating itself, but sometimes it's who does it, right? It's like, oh, if that person donated, I better donate. So watching other people be social and donating makes other people want to do it. This is modeling. In a study across 7 countries, they showed that viewing media that was very pro-social and very engaged in helping behavior later increased helping behavior across all of those countries. And we even see this in young kids like Dr. C, Carter, my son. It always reminds me of him. Socially responsive toddlers tend to have strong internalized consciousness, a strong internalized conscience, even as preschoolers. So when Carter was in preschool, he would start every morning, no matter how excited or sad. Some kids would come in crying, didn't want to go to school, didn't want to be away from mom and dad. And no matter how happy or sad they were, Carter would always come and give them a hug. And I didn't prompt him to do this. And he'd give a hug or a high five and he'd say, today's going to be great. We're going to have so much fun. And it was something, it's one of the things I was most proud of him for, even to this day. Later, when he started playing soccer, and he's been playing for 4 years, and I've coached his team every year, I always wonder how much he actually pays attention to me, but every time at halftime and after the games, I always went up to the other team, no matter how much we were winning by, if we were tied, if we were getting our butts kicked, and I would say, you guys are playing a great game. Thanks for being such great competition. And, at first he didn't do anything, but in the last 2 years, he's been going up to them either at halftime or after the game, even after the high fives and, going through the tunnels. And he's been saying, you guys are doing a great job. And I got to tell you, that makes me so proud. It makes every time I do that worth it. That he sees it and he mirrors it, right? Of course, this is not without its downsides. The stronger points of the Bobo doll experiment and what more people paid attention to was the antisocial effects when the adults were being mean to Bobo. So here we see from studies that abusive parents may have aggressive children. And again, when you ask them why, right, I feel like I've been repeating this over and over again, the answer is pretty simple. I saw my parents do it, so I do it. So we see a lot of times the negative effects, bullying and trolling on social media. Uh, when people watch TV or videos, especially movies like from the 80s and 90s when we weren't so politically correct and people didn't know better at this point. And these are, not, this isn't just, socially responsive people, but when you watch these types of movies and TV shows, a lot of times what it was teaching children, if they didn't really understand the message, bullying can be an effective tool for controlling others or getting their lunch money, that free and easy sex has little consequences later. This was way before the Me Too movement, where now it's coming up to catch them. We look at the Harvey Weinsteins, we look at the Bill Cosbys, right? It used to be a saying in the biz, quote unquote, that you slept your way to the top. If a female wanted a really good role, you'd go to the producer or the director and you would earn it, which is absolutely disgusting in this day and age. But that was the culture back then. Does that excuse it? Absolutely not. This is the message that these movies were sending, right? Of course, the stereotypes about men and women. Men should be tough and women should be gentle, right? It's a crock, but that's what you saw throughout the themes in these movies. And even movies today still have similar themes and similar writing. Just like a lot of people get the wrong ideas about mental illness from the media, they get these stereotypes from what they watch on TV. And because now you know that observable learning or observational learning is a huge part of how we learn about the world, they don't necessarily realize that the information they're seeing is bad or wrong. It's just what they're observing. In the violence viewing effect, what we see is that there are mixed results on if viewing violent games and TV shows and movies causes violence. I know that I've watched tons in my life, and it has never made me want to go out and hurt a person in real life. But what we see is that there are mixed reviews depending on what study you look at. A lot of people say violence does lead to these things. There was a huge debate before this COVID-19 thing where just last year, with all these school shootings and things like that happening, that the president and these people were saying, well, people aren't, guns aren't killing people. It's violent video games and violent media. Walmart even went a step further and they banned all, they could have banned all weapons because they sell a lot of weapons, guns and things like that for hunting and whatever in Walmart across the country. Nope. They decided that it would be better to ban all violent video games. Oh, how the world thinks. So, now we've gone through all of chapter 7. We've talked about automatic implicit classical conditioning. We've talked about explicit conscious operant conditioning. And we've talked about how, although behaviorism was the strongest for many years subtype of psychology, subfield, that even though Watson and Skinner claimed cognitive processing and learning did not play a part, we've seen today that that isn't exactly true. And this helps us to lead back into modern day, where we talk about the fact that observable behavior and mental processes are just as important. In observational learning, we have Albert Bandura, who said that people learn by watching others. Biological proof of this is those mirror neurons. And you see that this works in both good and bad ways. Thanks for listening. And as always, I'll talk to you guys soon.